Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining A4LI for this month's policy discussion. I'm very excited for the conversation we have planned today, and I hope all of you are as well. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Brianna Deutsch, VP of Political Affairs at A4LI. In today's conversation, I'll run a discussion with Dr. Andrew Scott for roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll move to audience Q&A. So please continue to put your questions in the chat throughout the discussion. Our guest today is Dr. Andrew Scott. Andrew is a professor of economics at the London Business School, where his research is focused on longevity and the aging society, among other topics. Andrew has also been an advisor on policy to a range of governments, is the co-founder of the Longevity Forum, and is co-author of the Amazon bestseller, The 100-Year Life. In this conversation, we'll discuss Andrew's research into the economics of longevity, how we should reimagine the stages of our lives as lifespan continues to increase, as well as what governments can do to prepare for longer living populations. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Brianna. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Well, I'm really curious to hear about the economics of longevity. But before we jump into that, I always like to hear how and why people became interested in longevity in the first place. So can you tell us a bit about, why as an economist, you thought longevity was an important topic to focus your research on?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think I get asked that question enough. I think it's key to ask everyone. It's a great question. And there's a number of things. One is just about my character. So I love ideas that have impact. And I'm an economist, but I have a very broad intellectual framework. And, you think about ideas, impact, and intellectual breadth, longevity is going to be fantastic. It's like, sort of a subject on steroids. It's just tremendous. So that's part of it. And as part of that interest, I guess it came to fruition, actually, for a couple of reasons, one professional, one personal. So at London Business School, I used to teach a course called World Economy, Problems and Prospects. There's a few more problems and prospects these days, but I'd give a talk about the aging society, and you know the story. There's a demographic transition, fewer younger people, more old people, and it's a relentlessly miserable story. Old people are a problem. They get ill. They're a burden. It's horrendous. But then, sort of 2/3 of the way through, I just stopped at this slide that said, on average, we're living longer, and on average, we're healthier for longer. And it's like, well, that sounds kind of quite good news. How we turn this good news story into a bad news story. And that got me to realize that rather than focus on a change in the age structure of the population, more old than young people, the biggest change was longevity, which was the young will now become the old. And so that's how I got into it, thinking about longevity. And then, I looked at the decisions my own children were making in their 20s, and they were radically different from the ones that I did, which in turn were radically different from the ones my parents did. And you think, actually, there's a life cycle issue here. Something is happening. So putting those all together, I thought, hey, actually, we got aging wrong, or at least incomplete. We're not focusing on longevity. We're thinking more about decline rather than the potential opportunity. And it just seems such a wonderful economic subject. Huge topic, incredibly important to us as individuals, major social implications. We have an incomplete understanding of it. And it's a subject that's just a dream for economists to look at. So that's how I got into it.
So we'll get into that a little bit later in the conversation, the actual economics of longevity. But first, let's turn to your best-selling book, The 100-Year Life. This book attempts to, challenge readers to rethink the current 3 stages of life, and that's, education, work, retirement. So how will longer life and health spans reshape this current framework?
Yeah, so thanks for mentioning the book, The 100-Year Life, which actually kind of emerged from that lecture I gave, and I wrote with my colleague, who's in our organizational behavioral group, Linda Grattan. And we said, well, the nature of work is going to change. And that book has been hugely successful and influential. And that's kind of now why all my research is in this area of longevity. But let me again, just perhaps, I'll answer that question in true academic fashion with a bit of a background, because the reason why I think this is a fascinating economic topic is longevity is ultimately about time. We'll talk about malleability later, but it's ultimately about having more time. And the classic mistake of an aging society is to assume this is all about end of life. But of course, if we have longer lives and we have more time, we can do things differently. And time is a social convention. You look at the Industrial Revolution, we invented the workday and leisure. We invented the weekend. We also developed a career structure because we invented 2 new stages of life in the 20th century, teenagers and retirement. those two stages didn't exist before. You went from being a child to being an adult. The word teenager is a relative neologism. So there was a fundamental change that happened, and we created this 3-stage life. And retirement was a great invention. It stopped people working until they died. We extended childhood with the introduction of teenagers. We had this linear career path. But of course, the challenge we've got now with so many older people is that our pension systems are under strain because retirement has got longer and there's so many more pensioners. And so governments around the world are just trying to change the parameters of a 3-stage life. They're trying to shift out the state pension age, reduce the pension you get, and increase your contribution rate. And actually, that may achieve financial stability, but it's actually just, I think, a bad thing to do. Because if you think about having more time, how do you change your life cycle? If I'm living as every age group is for longer, you've got more time ahead of you, you should behave differently at every age. That's what economics says. If you've got more future, you need to invest in that future. And rather than just focus on the financial side, we, in the 100-Year Life book, come up with this 4-asset framework: finances, your productive skills and knowledge, your vitality assets, that's your health, mental and physical, as well as your relationships, and also your ability to deal with change. And if all you do is just push back the state pension age, make that career get longer and longer and longer, that may solve the financial challenge. But what skills can you have in your 70s that are still relevant if you learn them at 20? You're probably going to have terrible health if you've been working as hard as we do right now. What about your relationships, either family, spouse, or broader community? And how will you have dealt with that process of change? So we felt that there's going to be a reinvention of the life cycle. I think you can already see it. I think adulthood is now taking longer to develop. So people are behaving very different in their 20s, going back to what my kids are doing. The age of marriage, age of having children, etc., is all happening much later. You're certainly seeing people retire later, get divorced later. You're seeing the rise of mid-career breaks. So careers are changing. And I think the main change is to say they're going from what we call a 3-stage life: education, work, retirement. They're probably going to evolve to a multi-stage life. We have lots of different stages to your career. Some may be a full-time job, others may be part-time, some may be about money, some may be a better work-life balance. But really what we're going to start to see is, whereas in the 20th century, that longer life fed into a lot of leisure after retirement, we're seeing retirement rapidly disappear as a simple concept. And I think we're going to see more leisure taken this side of retirement, sometimes in career breaks, sometimes in part-time work, sometimes with a more gentle slope as you start your career.
So I want to dive a little bit more into the actual economics of longevity. There are not many academics, as you probably know, researching this topic, despite the huge potential economic impacts of both the West and much of Asia's aging population. So, based on the research that you've done, what are some of the economic benefits of extending healthy lifespans?
Yeah, so I mean, of course, there's lots of economists looking at health and lots of economists looking at aging. And actually, last week here in London, I had 3 great conferences, and one of them was based around the economics of the longevity dividend, trying to make longevity a coherent framework to think about it. I think for me, what's interesting is that, as economists, in general, economists tell policymakers investing in health is good for growth. And that's about infant mortality, infant health, and midlife health. For some reason, that's not thought about at older ages. I think it's either because people think aging is inevitable and fixed and you can't do anything about it, or that these are just sort of non-productive people. So really, what my work is about is, how do we generate a 3-dimensional longevity dividend? We already have got longer lives, but we need health span to catch up with lifespan. And we also need to create a more productive lifespan. We need to support people working for longer. So there's lots and lots of nuances, but that's basically what I'm about: a 3-dimensional longevity dividend. Because if we are living longer in better health and we can work for longer, that's great. That's tremendous. And, I've done the work I'm doing the work in a variety of different ways. So one way is just putting a value on how important it is to age well. And I think what's very interesting, I'm sure most of the listeners will be aware of this, that whenever you talk about people living longer and longer lives, the biggest fear people have is of being ill when they get old. And it's kind of weird, because the natural response to that is then, well, what are you going to do to try and stop that from happening? And one of the things, the paper with Martin Ellison from Oxford and David Sinclair from Harvard, is we use health tools to try and put a monetary value on how much we appreciate health, and in particular, aging better. We know from COVID that we were prepared to do all sorts of things to the economy in order to save lives. It's clear that health is incredibly valuable to us. And if you look at life expectancy trends, what is the biggest health challenge we've got? Age-related diseases. Therefore, doing something about how you age is phenomenally valuable. So we do a whole bunch of work around that. And, we put some numbers on the value of living longer, the values of compressing morbidity, getting health span to increase lifespan, but also show that there's a virtuous circle around here, because of course, the longer you are in better health and the more productive you are for longer, the more you want to live for longer. So you have this virtuous circle at work that unlocks this three-dimensional dividend. And given how important health is, it's perhaps not surprising that we get that result that for the US, if you could slow down aging so that you lived 1 year longer and in better health, in present value terms, it's worth something like $37 trillion. I mean, it's a staggering number. That's a present value term. On an annuity basis, it's about 3 or 4% of GDP. But that just tells us health is incredibly important. What's the biggest thing we're worried about? Age-related diseases. This is a huge thing to focus on. Elsewhere, what I'm doing is trying to look at actually how do we get some of the economic, so that's about the value of aging better to us as individuals. But actually, what about GDP? So how do we support older workers? What has been the contribution of older workers to GDP? For instance, in the 10 years before COVID in the United States, around 3/4 of employment growth was driven by more people aged over 55 working. And of course, no one thinks about this. Everyone thinks it's about the younger people driving the economy. But increasingly, employment growth is happening at older ages. So how do we support that? And of course, health is part of that, but there's all sorts of things to do with giving people skills, the nature of the job they do, whether it's flexible, the cognitive component versus physical. So those are sort of issues. How do we exploit the gains we've already got to make sure that these longer lives are more productive ones? But also, how do we think about investing in the future to make things even better?
So you've done, a lot of this research about the economic benefits of longevity. And a lot of them are sort of intuitive once you really start to think about it. But, in general, especially, with government officials, sometimes you talk about senior citizens, the elderly, and for lack of a better term, sometimes they think about this population as a burden. Maybe they're a great voting constituency, but they also, are costing the government perhaps money. So have you had the opportunity to have these conversations? You're based in the UK with members of parliament. And if so, what sort of reception have you
That's the
received?
really interesting one. So I wanted, when we wrote the book, The 100-Year Life, for the 100-year phrase to kind of take on a life of its own. And people think, wow, okay, I mean, let's put aside the plausibility of whether or not people do face a 100-year life. Clearly, more and more people are going to be living to 100. And to think, well, how do I deal with that? And to try and change the narrative. I think, demographers have done us a disservice by focusing on this change in the age structure that says fewer young, more old. The most important change is kind of how our aging has changed.
Mhm.
And aging is malleable. Now, for me, for economists, there's two key aspects about longevity. One I've already mentioned, which is time. If we're living longer lives, everyone at every age has got more time ahead of them, which means you've got to be more forward-looking and behave differently. The second thing is the reason we've seen this increase in life expectancy is the degree to which mortality and to some extent morbidity are malleable. We can influence the relationship between health and mortality at each age. And if you think about the way most policymakers and culturally we think about older people, we measure things chronologically. So we talk about the number of people aged over 65 in the case of the old age dependency ratio. And of course, if you measure age chronologically and you do use that to define old, you're going to miss out on that forward-looking concept of longevity. The fact that a 65-year-old today has got more time ahead of them than past 65-year-olds and has to behave differently. And you're going to miss out that malleability. And this is, I think, the hardest thing because, for me, if I focus on longevity, as I say, the really, 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 really big change that's happened is for the first time ever in human history, the young can now have a more than 50% chance of reaching 80, 90, choose whatever number you want to try and pick. That's never happened before. So it's about the young becoming the old. Whereas we tend to say, oh, most young don't become old, so the old are a different group and they're negative, etc. And that's a real problem because we're not adapting to this fundamental human change that the young can now expect to become the old. And we need to therefore ensure that the current young become the healthiest ever future old. So what I found with governments is actually, it takes a while, it's drip, 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 water on a stone. But actually a lot of people within government are delighted to have a better news story about one of the biggest forces going forward. It's very hard to unwind all the thinking we have about what it is to be old. And of course, diversity is the key thing about aging. But, aging is about decline. Longevity seems to be about maintaining health for longer. And if you can make people recognize that there undoubtedly are problems, but there are also opportunities, actually politicians, I think, start to swing round. The hardest thing is then to just get rid of that continual mindset pulling you back to older ways of thinking about things. But, to have a news story that says to people, increasing the majority of voters, you've got to think differently, you have to age differently, and there are positives, it's a really powerful message. I think the challenge is, how do you change those long-standing cultural views, which have probably got worse over time, that aging is about decline, because we do tend to medicalize age rather than think about experience and skills and knowledge. And also actually what to do about it, because these are pretty fundamental changes we're talking about in society. Having to think about lifelong learning, thinking about longer working careers. There's a lot that needs to change to support this, what Laura Carstensen at Stanford calls a new map of life. So I would say two things. There's just getting the public to recognize that aging is happening differently, perhaps from past generations, and that has potential. It's a long time of just reinforcing that message, but I do think progress is being made. Then the second thing is actually, how do you then translate that into policies, which is a much harder question.
And I'm not sure if you've done any research into this in particular, but as economists, you're very familiar with GDP as a measurement of how well a country is doing. But I think we all sort of understand that GDP only says so much about a country's population, and there's so many other measurements we could potentially use to say how well a country and its people are doing. So what are your thoughts on perhaps adding an additional measurement to how we look at countries and determine how well they're doing? So perhaps a measurement for healthy life expectancy. Do you think that would sort of be a useful tool to see how a country is doing?
I do. I'm very keen on that, and I've written about that in a few places. I mean, GDP is great. It's a big number that's important for lots of different things, but no one number is going to take care of everything. And I think also, particularly when you go through pretty big structural transformations, GDP may be a bit misleading. We've seen during COVID, as I said, that we've decided to sort of take policies that restrict the economy in order to save lives. So it's pretty clear we think health is really important. So yeah, healthy life expectancy, I think, is a really good measure. I mean, it can be improved how we measure it, but something around healthy life expectancy is important. I mentioned the paper with Martin Ellison and David Sinclair. We've done a follow-up with a postdoc I have, Julian Ashwin, for a volume. And what we've done there is sort of say, well, we can put a dollar value on gains to healthy life expectancy. And we've got GDP, let's amalgamate the two to try and sort of get a broader measure of welfare. And you get very different rankings. Amongst the rich countries, the US is sort of second top in terms of GDP performance. But once you start to tack on healthy life expectancy, it goes second bottom. So, and you can see the drag of healthy life expectancy more and more in terms of the overall measure of welfare. So crucial. And I think, again, if you think about the logic, we have a lot more older people. And secondly, the young can now expect to become the old. So actually, healthy life expectancy, particularly focusing on those later years, is absolutely key. And I'll just come back to this simple-minded approach I have to longevity about the young becoming the old. If you've got a 20% chance of making it to 70 or 80, you don't structure your life thinking, I must maximize my health when I'm 70 or 80. I must maximize my working career, my relationships, etc. But if suddenly the probability is 60 or 70% of reaching those sorts of ages, then you really do have to think very differently. And that, I think, is that radical change that's happened. The young can now expect to become the old, which makes focusing on healthy life expectancy incredibly important.
So we've discussed, some of the benefits of increasing our lifespan and health span, but and you discuss those advantages in your book, but, living longer does come with some challenges. So what are some of those challenges and what can we do to prepare ourselves for them?
Yeah. I mean, as I say, if for me, longevity is about more time and malleability. So straight away, you've got to be more long-sighted. And that's a tough one, every day thinking about investing more in your future. And I'm good at that in some ways, terrible at it on others. So, this need to learn patience and farsightedness is going to be incredibly important. And then there's a certain responsibility, because if things are malleable and you can influence them, and I know you're very interested in the biological science side of things, but when it comes to the environment, pollution, comes to sleep, exercise, diet, all these things we know have a huge impact. So there's that sort of self-responsibility that comes around, but also I think a broader one in terms of the community we live in. So I think that's hard. I think for me, the really challenging one is that, this is not an area where a rising tide raises all boats. There is huge diversity in how people age, and we know that there are really big socioeconomic determinants of that. In London, North Kensington and South Kensington, they're cheek by jowl, but the life expectancy differences are enormous. So I think, the challenge we've got is how do we make sure that these healthy life expectancy gains, these productive life expectancy gains, are actually spread out through society. We did that before with infant mortality gains and midlife mortality gains. It's going to take a really, really big focus on that second half of life to achieve it, because I think inequalities compound over a lifetime. So that's going to be a really, really, really big challenge. I think intergenerational is going to be really important. As we have fewer children and we have more older people, then how society links intergenerationally is key. And, I'm worried about some of those things because people very easily fall into this young versus old, or the dreaded sort of Gen X versus baby boomers, whatever, which are poisonous. And I do hate the generational labels, because from a longevity perspective, the chance of the young becoming old has never been greater, but Gen Z will never become a baby boomer. So you just immediately start to create this tension between young and old. And then I think the other challenge is just narrative. It's we have long-standing views about the aging process and what it is to be old. And it's a big change that we're talking about. And if you look at the bioscience, it'll be even more dramatic. But even what's happening today and the gains to life expectancy that occurred requires thinking very differently about our social concepts of old, our social concepts of aging. And that's a problem, because there was a great academic paper recently I read, which was used machine learning techniques to look at how we think about aging over the last 200 years. And through the medicalization of age, we've now got much more negative views about aging. And that's a really big challenge, when actually the longevity agenda says we've got to be more forward-looking and invest in it. So I think that's some of the challenges.
Well, and I know, you have various roles within the government, including you're on the advisory board of the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility. And I'm sort of curious about the conversations you have there, and perhaps the topic of longevity hasn't really come up yet. But I'm curious, governments have a finite amount of resources. They can only appropriate funds for so many different things. And if the goal here is to extend healthy lifespans, healthy being the key term here, where do you think, government assets should be prioritized? Are you more interested in having them pour funds into lifestyle interventions, healthy lifestyle interventions, or into medical biotech, or addressing sort of income gaps? Where do you think money should be prioritized?
So a great question in terms of sort of those roles. My background as an economist, the first 25, 30 years of my career was on monetary and fiscal policy. So that's sort of how those roles came about. And it's really interesting in getting into the longevity space, getting out about, meeting all sorts of interesting people outside of econ, and then having sort of formed some views, think, okay, let's get something done. I turned around to see who I talked to, and it's like, oh, where are they? And I realized I had to go back to the econ and finance ministries, because I think if you can get them engaged, then there's some serious money that can be put into this. And economics tends to focus on an aging society rather than longevity. So that is what I'm trying to do. I think, you know, organizations like the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is the kind of the UK equivalent to the Congressional Budget Office, I think they're a great place to start because they do those long-term projections of what's going to happen to the economy. And once you start thinking that longer lives require a different life cycle, you start to see some of the potential for working longer. And then, well, how do I support people working for longer? And I think that to me is the sort of how we start to shift the debate. Let's bring it back into GDP. To answer your question, sort of where would be the things to try and focus on? I guess I'll put three simple buckets for now. Yeah, certainly funding the fascinating stuff that's happening in the biology of aging seems, you know, a simple one to go for. I do think focusing more on the health system on prevention rather than intervention, and particularly public health, and looking at the role of the environment and the built environment in achieving that. The one I'm most keen to focus on is actually employment. And I think there's been far too much focus around the retirement age, which always gets controversial because, you know, people already are working way beyond the state pension age or retirement age, but it's always politically contentious to try and change it. But if you look at what happens to employment, it starts to fall from 50 onwards. And there is an enormous boost to GDP that can happen if we can stop that decline in employment from 50 plus. So the question is, how do you do that? Some of that is about the health of the people retiring. Some of it is about caring, so they have to leave. Some of it is just about maintaining people's skills. And the other is tackling aging in the workplace. So for me, that would be the place I would absolutely begin first of all, because if you can get that decline, remove that decline in employment from 50 to 65, you'd have an enormous boost to GDP. I think you'd start to say, oh, this second half of life, we can use this positively. So that would be absolutely, I think, where I would start with the Ministries of Finance today, as well as those other ideas I had.
Just a few more questions for me before we jump to audience Q&A, because I know there's some questions piling up there in the chat. So, you know, you're based in the UK, you've worked with the government there, so you're probably a little bit more familiar with what they're doing in regards to preparing for the aging population and just, you know, paying attention to the, you know, the topic of longevity. So what do you think, you know, in comparison to the States, what do you think the UK is doing better? Are there things the US could learn from the UK, or perhaps are there things that the US is doing better than the UK?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, if you look at the life expectancy and healthy life expectancy data, you wouldn't particularly sort of have a competition between the UK and US to see who's doing either of it well. We tend to do quite poorly. And I think inequality is part of that. I think where the UK and US are doing better is having older people work for longer. That's not entirely successful, but I think that's an area. And if you look at the private sector funding around bioscience, I think the US is ahead of UK, but both are trying to do something. I think the trouble on the policy side is thinking about how quickly you want change to happen. And, you know, in some ways, I'm kind of impressed at the change. So in the UK, there has been low-level mumblings about making a target for +5 more years of healthy life expectancy. Exactly how high a target that is, it's sort of a little bit subject to change. But I think that's great. And if you can try and cement that more, that will start to then bring about a change and a realignment. And I haven't seen the same happen in the US. So I guess that would be one of the bigger ones. In general, I would say the big government departments, the ministries of finance, the central banks, ministries of health, are still not really focusing on this. They're still thinking of an aging society rather than longevity. So there's still a great deal of progress to be done. I would say Japan, because it's got so many more older people, is probably more advanced in thinking about how to make the most of that for the economy. But I think what's interesting about Japan is that its birth rate is so dramatic that it's really got the change in the age structure of the population to deal with in a much more aggressive way than the UK and the US, where I think the UK and the US has had a slower demographic transition. So we can actually focus much more on trying to get the gains to life expectancy and healthy life expectancy.
So just one final question for me before we move to audience Q&A. As you continue your research into the economics of longevity, what sort of further questions do you think need to be explored?
Oh, Lordy. I mean, that's the exciting thing as an academic. I mean, there's just loads of them. I mean, I guess I would sort of slightly separate the being explored from kind of the academic search for truth, as it were, and then the sort of raising awareness and getting engagement. And on the engagement one, how do we shift the dialogue from a negative one about inevitable decline to something more positive? We can do something about it. And there, by the way, I think the whole bioscience stuff was really interesting because I'm not a scientist, but I think people react with a mixture of awe and revulsion and credulity towards it. But what that is saying is that age is malleable, and it's probably more malleable than you might imagine. And however people react or believe in that, I think it starts them to make aware, oh, there's things we can do about aging, whether that's just exercise, if they're more comfortable with that, or the more dramatic things. I think that's a hugely important part of changing the mindset. I do think getting younger people involved in this, getting them to recognize just how important it is key. I go to so many meetings where everyone's over 50, myself included, and partly that's about aging trends. But this really is, if the big change is the probability of the young becoming old, how do we get a younger age group engaged is really important. On the economic side, as I say, I think it's just working out a new model of the life cycle. So as we increase life expectancy and health, what do we do differently at each age? And how do we support that? Because if we can support that, then we'll create the economic resources to finance a longer life. But how do we think about the changes of the life cycle? And interestingly for me as an economist, that's going to involve a lot more focus on older people, because I don't think we have a good theory about aging and the passage of time in economics. So actually, we need to understand how behavior changes over the whole life cycle, but we've never really given much thought to how people want to do in the second half of life. And most of our theory of their behavior is based around constraints. They can't do things, or they've stopped work, so they don't want to do anything anymore. And I think that's a problem. So I would put, at the heart of it all is just understanding preferences over the life cycle and how we change. Because once you've got that new map of life, you can then start thinking about the policies to support it. This is a huge social experiment that we're going through, how to make use of this extra time. It's I think a foundational topic.
Thank you, Andrew, so much for the conversation. I'm now going to move over to audience Q&A. So the first one is from Benjamin, and Benjamin is sort of bringing up the topic of automation and how that's going to impact the job market. That's already a huge topic for economists, something that people are concerned about. So, as people are living longer and as more and more jobs become automated and there's perhaps fewer jobs available, how do we approach that issue? What are your thoughts on it?
So the new long life, which is the sort of follow-up to the 100-year life, looked at technology and longevity together. So there's loads of issues here. The first is, will automation lead to fewer jobs? And it doesn't have to. I think if we can focus on a technology that augments humans rather than replaces humans, I see no reason why we should lose jobs. But that's not an automatic process. I think what is interesting about automation is that you're going to see, I think, actually a type of job that's going to probably favor older workers. I mean, the simple way of putting it is, machines get better at being machines, humans need to get better at being humans. And so actually, some of those skills often are alleged, and I don't like any form of age stereotypes, to be amongst older workers. If you look at how, the brain changes over time, there's never one age where you're best at everything. But some of those sort of dealing with ambiguity, dealing with emotions, dealing with teams, do seem to peak a bit stronger at older ages. And then, of course, you've got a lot of older consumers who may prefer older workers. Actually, the paper I'm working on at the moment with Darren Acemoglu at MIT and Nikolai Muhlbach is very interesting, because we're looking at what's behind the growth in employment in the US labor market. And it's still early days, but there's been a tremendous performance of employment at older workers. You've seen jobs get less physical and get more cognitive. And what's interesting is you've sort of seen older workers get more of the better jobs, at least what I'm seeing at the moment. There's a thing called the hollowing out of the middle, where jobs are disappearing in the middle, and there are either lots of low wage jobs or lots of high wage jobs. looking at what's happening to older workers, they're getting a lot more of the better jobs and very few of the poor jobs. Partly that's because they're just more educated than they were. There's been a big increase in the number of college graduates amongst older populations. But also it may be something to do with their control of the labour market. But I think, this is, I do not think, I think we're going to get into technology that actually could well be supportive of older people. That would be the gist of what I'm saying.
So another question sort of on technology, how optimistic, you sort of just began to answer this, how optimistic are you that, various technologies, be it biotech or perhaps wearable devices, how much of impact do you think that could potentially have on increasing people's health spans?
So as economists, I'm always told never to give numbers and never give dates. So all I can say is I'm sure it's going to be a very positive impact. So it should be huge, shouldn't it? I mean, I don't know when it's going to come along. But there should be an impact from all of those things. We've got technologies to help us with preventative health. We've got new discoveries happening. I can't begin to comment whether it's going to be a sudden exponential breakthrough, a continuation of past trends, but it will increase. And the logic of the Nature Aging paper just says more and more, as we live longer, the most important thing is to age well. More and more resources will be aimed at aging well. And the better we get at aging, the more we're going to value further increases. So there's that economic version, I guess, of Tom Kirkwood's disposable soma in a way, just saying that we're going to start throwing more and more resources at it. So then the pipeline will be the behavioral change and the biological limits. But there must be further progress to come. And that is the longevity dividend. I'm deliberately not giving numbers and dates because I just don't think I've got any credibility to add to that. But these are the channels, and then we've got to think about which ones are most important to us.
So we've discussed this a little bit as well already, but when it comes to, governments focusing on longevity, making it a priority, ensuring that their, elderly population is still productive and is in good health, how much of a competitive advantage do you think that will give countries in the future?
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And talking about how governments are changing their mind on this topic, what they all do latch on to is, wow, there's lots more older people. If I can crack this market, I'm going to do brilliantly. So Japan has done it. The UK, as part of a post-Brexit strategy, was focusing on, or said it would focus on this. So there's certainly governments around the world say, okay, if I want to encourage certain industries, which ones are going to be great? And it's selling things to older people. I think what is so interesting again in that, and it's a great question, is what I would call a distinction between what I call the silver economy, which everyone knows about, which is just older people, and then what I think I'll call the evergreen economy, which is focusing on aging better. And I still think too many governments think about the silver economy and selling adult diapers and walkers, etc. But of course, I will pay a lot to be looked after if I got dementia, or I hope someone will pay that money anyway, but I will pay a fortune to avoid it. And I think that's where governments should be seeking their competitive advantage.
Some people make the argument, another audience question, that if we delay the onset of diseases, okay, you're pushing costs into the future by a couple of years, but those costs will still be there at the end of the day. So at the end of the day, is it worthwhile for governments who may only be concerned about the economics, let's say, to focus on delaying the onset of diseases?
So, yeah, and I've heard this story a lot too about helping people survive cancers, etc. So let me say, as a economist, what I find quite interesting, and I don't know where the questions come from economists or not, but in the health sphere, I find very interesting that people try and justify aging better in terms of lower health costs, because that's not how an economist would think. It's like, well, health is really valuable. If it's valuable, spend money on it. And that is the whole history of healthcare costs over time. As we get richer, we spend more money on health. So I would be really careful of trying to make the case for longevity in terms of containing health costs, because who knows, but it's probably pretty likely some of those costs may be quite high. But if the thing everyone fears about being old is being in poor health, they are prepared to spend a lot of money to be in good health. So if I postpone by a year those costs, I get some good health now, and I just postpone the costs. As an economist, that's an improvement because I've got one more year of health, which is really important. I've still got those costs, but they're just being delayed. But of course, the key thing is to compress the period of morbidity at the end of life, because we value healthy life even more than life itself. But I say, I think we have to face it. I think it's really interesting, this sort of debate we have on longevity, where people talk about longer lives and the reaction is, I'm frightened about getting ill. The logical consequence is to say, well, do an awful lot now to make sure that you're going to be in good health as possible. And I don't know, somehow that connection isn't made for most people.
So this next question is from Sonia, and she asks, how do you imagine the economy changing once we extend health spans by a significant amount? What areas of the economy do you believe will grow and what areas may shrink?
Yeah, well, of course, the life expectancy has increased considerably already and the economy has grown. So I just go back, we know for across the life course that if you improve health, you improve the economy. And we just got to make sure people understand that more and more for the older ages. I mean, this goes back a little bit, what do people want as they get older? And of course, if people are aging differently, I'm not sure we know the answer to that question. Often our theory of aging is based around health and chronological age. So we say that older people want walkers, they want cruise ships, etc. I don't know if that's true if they start to age better. And what I do know is that let's say 70 is biologically the same as 50 and the 70 is the new 50. I think that's misleading. 70 would just be the new 70. And there'll be something about someone who's 70 chronological and 50 biological that is different from 50 chronological and 50 biological. And I don't yet know if I understand what it is. Do people get bored and they want something different? Do they say, I've got enough shit, I don't want any more materialistic stuff? And I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question, but I think it will be services. I think it will be more meaningful interactions. So yeah, that's what I hazard a guess at, but I don't know, it could be quite non-materialistic.
So this next question is from Aubrey DeGray, and he has a question about the Wolverine scenario. So he goes, what's the latest on the Wolverine scenario? And for those of us who don't know what that is, can you please explain and then answer his question?
Yeah, so hi, Aubrey. So in the Nature Aging paper, we try and, so as an economist, when you're modeling these health changes, you're playing around with a survival curve and a health function curve. And we sort of give it some names based on characters from history, from fiction. So we have the Strudberg case from Gulliver's Travels, which is where you just live longer, but health at every age doesn't improve. So you just live longer in declining health. We have a Dorian Gray scenario where you don't change life expectancy, but you're just health as a function of age improves continuously till health span matches lifespan. We have a Peter Pan one, which is where you slow down aging. Then we have a Wolverine one, which is a sort of a regeneration one where you reset biological age. Now, what was, and there's the Wolverine one is very interesting. I'm sure it's interesting biologically, but it's also interesting economically because resetting, there's economic question like how often do you choose to reset and what's the cost of doing it? Aubrey, the simple answer, we did start looking at doing, so we looked at one-off interventions where you suddenly say at 70 can go back to 50. Compared to Peter Pan and Wolverine, actually, there's not big differences in them economically. There's obviously huge differences in them biologically. But we started Aubrey looking at repeated Wolverine every year, but that actually then just starts to look like Peter Pan, actually. So we found that at least mathematically, without thinking about the cost of doing them, they actually just merged into one, the Peter Pan and the Wolverine, if you do them continuously. So then it's all about what is feasible biologically rather than a particular economic difference.
So we have a question from Bernard about the distributive justice of longevity. You sort of mentioned previously that, already right now, lifespan is different from, a wealthier area of the country versus a poorer area of the country. So how do we sort of address these socioeconomic factors that, impact health spans and lifespans?
I think, we can see a huge role for education here. I personally, I think this is where we start to get involved in local communities. I think Public health is going to have to play a huge role, both in providing resources and providing information. But it's also, I think, how we build up social capital in certain groups. But it's, you know, I'm a macroeconomist, and now you're asking me to drill down into distributional issues. I think, you know, what we know right now is some of that gap is going to be about access to medical resources and accesses to behavior. But it's, you know, it's not about the appliance of science. These are behavioral and social economic determinants. It could be, for instance, the quality of work and the quality of a job, or even the absence of a job, probably, I suspect. So I think, you know, Darren Acemoglu, when he talks about technology, says good jobs are great because they get people a role, they give people finances, and they give people a social identity. I think we need to think about that very hard as one of the causes of trying to reduce this inequality in lifespan and health span.
So another question from the audience. You mentioned sort of the negative stigmas attached to the medicalization of aging. Do you think this could affect efforts to declare aging as a disease, or do you think aging should even be classified as a disease?
Well, you never want to take linguistic advice from an economist, is the first thing I would say here. I mean, so I would say, you know, my approach to this is sort of twofold. One is philosophical and one is practical. You know, clearly, aging seems to be a systematic feature linked to lots of age-related diseases. So focusing on how to maintain health by slowing down aging, reversing aging seems absolutely paramount. If you want to call it a disease, I can understand why. It does seem to trigger a really unhelpful debate. I know why this is needed, because this is in terms of getting FDA treatments, insurance and approval, etc. I just really kind of wonder if it's a little bit counterproductive the way it's done at the moment. So are there workarounds like Nia Barzilai is doing with the TAME survey, where actually you can solve the regulatory loopholes without actually having to classify it as a disease? As I say, that's not my point of view. When I play around these models, I've just got an aging function and I see it linked to diseases. It's just a function. But there does seem to be something deeper involved in all this. And I can see both sides. I think, you know, the challenge of trying to get people to think positively about age and trying to be proud of being old, or to, and that's not about decline, just being old is not a bad thing to fear. And actually, how do we invest in it? There are some problems in calling aging a disease.
So here's another question from the audience. Do the economic benefits of longevity you've quantified include the cognitive benefits of being better able to adapt to new processes and technologies? Or as longevity research advances, how can we prevent creating a situation where it is the young versus the old?
Yeah, so let me go back to the economic question. So there are, I would say, three ways you can talk about the economic benefits of aging better. One is what we do in the Nature Aging paper. Let's just put a dollar value on better health. And those are standard economic health tools used for a variety of treatments. And we can just apply them to healthy longevity. And that is, this is how much it's worth to us. Just as, you know, I keep going back to COVID, Reveal Preference showed that actually we valued, you know, improvements in saving lives worth so many $1 billion because of the GDP declines we created. We can do a same sort of sum for healthy aging. So it's literally, what is it worth to us? Forget about GDP. There is another approach, which is, you know, how much cost savings there's going to be. But as I said, I'm really wary of going down that route, because what if you come up with technologies that don't do cost savings but prolong life? That's brilliant. But cost savings, I think, is a limited way of looking at it. The third one, which is what this question hints at, is what can we say about how these things boost GDP? And that is important for finance ministries. It's what I'm trying to develop. But I guess the simplest way I put it is, just as understanding the biology of aging is complicated, understanding how this complex system, the economy, changes when you change longevity. There's so many different strands, including this one here. Like if I do more education, I'm cognitively sharper, and so I'm more innovative and can deal with new technologies, that's going to have a boost to GDP. But, you know, there's not a simple model that can come up with that number right now, because there's a lot of choices and decisions that need to be made to try and work out what that is. So I would say at the moment, where we miss an economic model that properly enables us to quantify the GDP effects on longevity, because they're going to be complicated. And I think that's a long-term research program, which hopefully I'll be contributing to. But the numbers I gave you do not include those benefits. They are just how do we use health tools to value these gains.
All right, just a few more.
Yeah.
Oh, go on.
No, just on the young versus old. I think this is key. I say this is why I like the word longevity rather than aging. It's aging is a very complicated word that is owned by lots of different people in lots of different ways, and most of the territory that goes with it is not, I think, the key part of what we're talking about here. And I say, for me, what is different about the modern world, it's not just there's more old people than young for the first time ever, but that probability of the young becoming old. And how we get that message across, it's so hard because it is a really fundamental change in human life.
So just a few more questions from the audience before we wrap up. So the next one is about the drop in life expectancy that we've seen over the past 2 years, couple of years. So what can we do to get back on track?
Yeah. So, let me just make a statistical point, first of all. So if you look at things like best practice life expectancy, that's the country which at any point in time has the highest average life expectancy. You see less of a dip in that because, of course, it's best practice. So you go choose the country that's least affected. But also, if you go back to things like the Great Influenza pandemic, the First World War, you see a downward blip, but then the trend continues afterwards. Because all those life expectancy statistics that you're hearing are period measures of life expectancy. So that assumes that a mortality curve exists forever. That the 2021 life expectancy number in the US is based on the 2021 mortality curve, holding for the entire duration of a newborn's life. So I think you will see, as COVID hopefully recedes into the background, quite big increases again in life expectancy. Although we'll have to see what the long-term impact of COVID has been on people's health and the pressures on the health resources, etc. So there will be, I think, a pretty significant automatic comeback. I think for me, what's interesting about all of this is how it's given the center stage to health. It's given every individual a great deal of practice on self-testing and self-diagnostics, and a recognition of the importance of prevention rather than intervention. And I hope that will all be, fertile territory for all the wearables and tests, etc., that were mentioned earlier, to try and build upon. I don't always want to sound optimistic in this world, but I think there is that grounds for optimism there. We will see. Clearly, public finances will be much more stretched, so that could be a negative as well. But I think there are, in this terrible pandemic, a few longer-term health positives that might emerge.
So our final question is a hypothetical one. So typically in science, or just when there's, shifts in society, it happens over an extended period of time, and we have time to adapt to these changes, both, culturally and economically. But, hypothetically speaking, if tomorrow we had access to a magical pill that dramatically extended our health and lifespans, what sort of disruption would this create to society as a whole?
Yeah, I don't know. There's invention and then there's innovation. I think that there will be a lot of puzzlement, freaking out, disbelief, etc. So I'm not sure you will ever get this really, really dramatic change, because there will be just roll-up issues, behavioral change issues. I think what I will answer this question with is sort of an observation rather than an answer. It's a fascinating scenario, but I can build it in lots of different ways. When I first got into this area, I come at it from a social science point of view, and then I would hear the sort of the biological point of view. And, at first it's like, wow, that sounds kind of incredible. It's amazing if it happens, but that's going to be really hard and difficult. I'm a macroeconomist. I know about how complicated it is to manage a system subject to shocks by just a couple of levers. But actually, over time, I've begun to think that actually it might be easier to make scientific progress than it will be to change our social and cultural views about what it is to be old, what it is to age. they are really deep-seated because they've been running for millennia. So I think what this question is good at is saying, wow, actually the science could make more rapid progress than the behavioral change, which is why I think it's incredibly important to have this dual science and behavioral change approach. It's about changing the narrative. And what is amazing is everyone knows at an individual level that aging is malleable. You know, they just know there's things they can be doing or should be doing that influences how they age. And, you know, whether it's these sort of extreme scenarios, the world changing overnight or whatever, we just got to get people to say, hey, you already know this. What are you going to do to try and prepare for this and make the most of it? And I think that's the narrative change, which somehow we get at an individual level, but we can't quite project at a social level.
Well, that's all, the time we have for today. And Andrew, we just want to thank you again for your time. Your insight was very interesting and we really appreciate it. And we look forward to continuing to follow your work. And I just want to thank our audience for joining us. And I wish everyone the rest of, the good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from. And we look forward to having you at our policy discussion next month. So thank you again, and everyone enjoy the rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Thank you.